I'm Mara Bernstein. I'm the Director of Synagogue Programming and Adult Education here at Park Avenue Synagogue, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight in our sanctuary and our viewers at home from wherever you are. For those of you who may not be familiar, Jewish Lives is a prize-winning series of biographies designed to explore the many facets of Jewish identity. Subjects are thoughtfully paired with authors to create lively, deeply informed books. 53 biographies have been published to date, including Moses, Man Ray, Yitzhak Rabin, Barbara Streisand, Emma Goldman, and many, many more. Jewish Lives is a partnership of Yale University Press and the Leon D. Black Foundation. You can learn more about their prize-winning series at jewishlives.org. Tonight we're here to celebrate the book launch of Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, and we're so honored to have author Julian Zelizer here to discuss the life of the Jewish civil rights leader, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Tonight's program will be a dialogue between Julian and Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of Park Avenue Synagogue. We have received so many audience questions in advance of this program, so thank you all who have submitted, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can during our program tonight. We will also have time to take questions from our in-house audience. Thank you all for being here. Two quick final notes before we begin. Julian Zelizer's biography, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, is available at a special discount of 25% off plus free shipping at jewishlives.org. Just use the code Heschel at checkout. This is a limited time offer, only available at jewishlives.org. And finally, a special thank you to our partners at American Jewish University and Jewish Lives. We are so grateful for your support and your partnership. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel. Our moderator this evening is Rabbi Elliot J. Cosgrove, Senior Rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, who earned his rabbinic ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary and a PhD at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He serves on the Executive Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly and the Editorial Board of Conservative Judaism. An officer of the New York Board of Rabbis, he is an advisor on interfaith affairs to the Anti-Defamation League and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of 10 volumes of sermons and the editor of Jewish Theology in Our Time. Our guest this evening, Julian E. Zelizer, is a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, where he has been one of the pioneers in the revival of American political history. He is the author and editor of 19 books and has written for CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. His latest book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, is released today. Thank you both so much for being here. We're honored to host this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. It is wonderful to welcome people here in person. It is wonderful to welcome the hundreds upon hundreds of people who are joining us virtually for this evening's launch program of this fabulous new biography on Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dr. Zelizer. Julian, it's wonderful to welcome you here on this day, the day that the book is actually being released. What an honor it is for us to host you. It is very rare that I encounter a book which combines the level of scholarship, the accessibility, the readability of this volume, a biography on a figure who's important to understand in the moment of his or her living, but also with a message that's so critically important to understand today. So let me just begin with words of congratulation on this very exciting day of your life.
Thank you so much, and it's great to launch the book here in our synagogue.
19, I didn't even know you had written 19 books. I know you had written a lot of books, but I think when the library of Julian Zelizer is set out on a bookshelf, I have to imagine someone will look at this book and say, which of these books do not belong here? Right? You've written books on Gingrich, you've written books on Carter, you've written books on congressional reform, you have more books on their way, assessing presidential legacies, Lyndon Johnson, other. what's the story of this book in the sense of how does a historian of U.S. history approach the legacy of Abraham Joshua Heschel?
Well, I think the key was to approach it through the lens of U.S. history. And my goal was to put him into some kind of bigger context, to understand him as a figure of this country in the 1950s and 60s, in terms of what was happening with religious life in this country, what was happening in the 60s with civil rights and Vietnam. And there were kind of two particular origins for me. One, I wrote a book on Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society in 2015, and one of the stories I tell was the role of religious organizations and figures in the civil rights movement and how important they were in terms of putting pressure on dealing with the racial injustices in this country. And so Heschel was part of that world, and I knew that also because I come from a rabbinic family, and so he was a figure who I knew about. I had seen the picture at Selma, and I had a conversation with Rabbi Shai Held when he spoke at Princeton, and we were at dinner, and he said, that picture at Selma, it's so iconic, it so captures this connection between religion and activism during the 1960s. I just jumped at the opportunity to write the book. But for me, the key is not to write it internally, but to put his biography in the life of this country in many ways.
Right, because there are other biographies of Heschel, and so from Warsaw, you know, his life story as someone who came out of a certain world, but it sounds like this is a different kind of biography of Heschel in the sense that you're setting him in the American context, in America's political history. You mentioned, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, that there's also a personal dimension to this because of being the son and the grandson. You come from a rabbinic family. So can you speak more about that? What was it like to learn about the Jewish Theological Seminary, the sort of formation story of what we know as contemporary American Jewry, the figures that I imagine were friends with your father and your grandfather? How was that exploration?
It was great. I mean, most of my books are not about figures who I am personally connected to in any way, other than people I study and I'm interested in. But Heschel came from a world that I was very familiar with. And it comes from a world where I sat around the dinner table and I would hear about some of the people who were very close to him, like Wolf Kelman, who my father also interacted with. And many of the rabbis who are in this story are rabbis who I heard about. So there was a personal element. And it wasn't simply, oh, I'm writing about my family. It was an attempt to understand this world of religion that I appreciated through the dinner table that I don't think a lot of historians write about. I mean, a lot of the work on religion is focused on the religious right and conservatism. It hasn't focused as much on a more progressive vision of religion, nor has it really captured a place like the Jewish Theological Seminary and New York City after World War II, and what religion was like and the diversity of voices in that religious world. And so my father and my grandfather, who was also a conservative rabbi, kind of opened a path for me to really understand not just the people, but how you get into an institution like this and what religion meant more broadly in this country, especially conservative Judaism. So it was wonderful. And there is a place in the book where both my grandfather and father are in a scene. Where my father is getting ordained. King was at the rabbinical assembly and has a message for the rabbis, and my grandfather was getting an honorary degree at that moment. And I had no idea. I literally had written a lot of this, and then I was in our apartment, and I looked at the old program that my father had given me from his ordination, and there, like, the whole story was there, so I even stuck it in the book.
Wow. That's very moving. It must have been very moving. And I certainly hope if you sell the movie rights to this book that you have a clause in the contract that you get to decide who plays your father and grandfather in the movie. So let's turn to the legacy of Heschel itself, because as I'm thinking about this and the prophetic voice of Heschel, And I think, was Heschel's prophetic voice a result of the Holocaust? Was it a result of his doctoral dissertation, which was actually on the prophets? Or perhaps it came from somewhere else? So how would you tell, this conversation is going to lead into his activism, but where were the seeds of his activism planted?
Yeah, I mean, when you ask a historian this question, it's a little bit like a rabbi. You're going to get many answers, and they're all right. So part of this is born in Europe. I mean, the first two chapters of my story are about his upbringing in Warsaw, and then his going to get a doctorate at the University of Berlin. And I think part of the experience of being Jewish, a Hasidic Jew, but just Jewish in this world that was fraught with tension, was clearly part of his awareness of suffering. In Warsaw, he saw poverty all the time. His family didn't have great wealth. And he always felt the weight, obviously, of anti-Semitism, both in Poland and then obviously in Germany, where he is literally, in the end, kicked out by the Gestapo. So I think the origins of being a Jew in that European world were very important to his understanding suffering. I think, secondly, his experience in World War II and the Holocaust was horrendous. He was in Cincinnati. He comes in 1940. A guy named Julian Morgenstern, who's the head of HUC, the Hebrew Union College, brings him. He's trying to rescue Jewish intellectuals. And he spends 5 years in Cincinnati. He spends his summers here in New York. And much of his family perishes in the Holocaust, including his mother and 3 sisters. And so that profoundly shapes him. And during that time, he was very distraught. I found a story someone had told where, he would turn the radio on Friday before Shabbat started and just let it keep playing until Shabbat ended, because he wanted to hear the news from World War II. He wanted to hear what was happening with his family. And a lot of his writing in the 1950s, and then a lot of his speeches about civil rights, often are referring to what World War II wrought on the world. Not just the Holocaust, but Hiroshima. He talks about those two kind of twin catastrophes in modern society as very defining. And so I think that was important. And then his work. He is a scholar. He's a writer. And in the 50s, as many religious intellectuals were after the war, they're wrestling with, how do you have a belief in God? What does spirituality mean in a world that has just been decimated with just horrific events in the early 1940s? And his writing, his famous books are about this relationship between God and man. And I think he's trying to work out some of that and some of those questions. And finally, the encounter with the civil rights movement and the black church is very important to him. He finds in the church a kind of spirituality that he thought was absent in conservative synagogues. And he also finds in King and Andrew Young and many of the civil rights leaders that kind of prophetic voice that he had written about, but felt was absent in this country as so many people were dying. So I think all of those kind of combined to create the Heschel that we ultimately know.
Right. I have to tell you, the chapter, I had an advanced copy of the book, but the chapter on those years at HUC, I found to be particularly illuminating, because I think the story of Heschel is often told as, oh, it was HUC who brought him over, but then he spent his career at JTS. But between 1940 and 45, I believe, the fact that those were the very years, not just where he learned of his family members perishing, but also where he saw the world stand by with inaction, that I think, as you tell it, was really the seed of his own insistence on action and activism in his own career. So a very powerful and frankly new for me to learn of those years of great sorrow and loneliness, existential and otherwise, in his life.
Yeah, and there's all these threads in that 5 years that were really interesting. I mean, so he would spend his summers in New York. He loved the city. He really liked what JTS was at that moment, which was one of the premier seminaries, really not just for conservative Judaism, but more traditional Judaism as well. But two things he does during those years. One, here in New York, he goes to a rally that takes place in Madison Square Garden to support saving Jews and saving Jewish refugees. And it has a big impact. It's a big rally. A lot of prominent people are there, including the mayor of New York. Franklin Roosevelt sends a message that's read out loud. In 1943, he goes to Washington, and through an Orthodox rabbi in Cincinnati, who he was very close to, and there's something called the Rabbis' March, where a group of about 500 very religious Orthodox rabbis, they go to Union Station and they start marching through Washington, and it was a sight to see. And they meet Henry Wallace, and they meet with the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House, and he's one of the group, it turns out. And they end up in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and they read a petition calling for saving Jewish refugees, and I think they sing Adon Olam. I can't remember, to the tune of the Star Spangled Banner. And those years were important. Both he starts to taste what activism is from the perspective of saving Jews, and he's also frustrated because he keeps going back then, and he's like, no one's listening. Like, we just did this, and he's back in Cincinnati, and he's frustrated with the Jewish community too for not being forceful enough and not really taking a stand. So those years were important. And I'll add one last thing. In Cincinnati, he also starts to meet a number of people, including one guy at HUC who's a very kind of progressive, active rabbi who starts to take him around on the weekends to meet with people who are living in poverty and to counsel them. So all these things happen that I think were quite important, and it was more than just a 5-year kind of interregnum. I think it actually had an impact on him.
So, trying to place Heschel as a post-Holocaust theologian, the first book I think he wrote in just what post-Holocaust was The Earth is the Lord's, which is his sort of treatment of the world that was lost. And then, of course, is The Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, and the theological legacy that we know to be Heschel's. But are we to understand Heschel's writings as an extended meditation on the trauma of the Holocaust, or is that too much of a box to put in him? Who was he in dialogue with? What was he reading at the time, Jewish, non-Jewish? How can you begin to paint a picture here?
Yeah, I wouldn't put it just in that box, because that would really limit how he was thinking. And he was in dialogue with both in the Jewish Theological Seminary. There's different factions, or different factions is the wrong word, but different figures. Mordechai Kaplan is one, Saul Lieberman, who are making different arguments about what Judaism should mean in the contemporary world, and how it should be practiced, and kind of what was the core of Jewish life. And so you have a Kaplan talking about the synagogue as an institution being the center for a kind of culture of Judaism. And you have Lieberman talking about halakha, the laws. And there's Heschel kind of bringing spirituality and thinking of those kinds of questions and arguing that's what Jews needed to be thinking about. Otherwise, the synagogues would in some ways be barren over time. People had to know why they were praying, not just be told to pray. So he was in dialogue with these rabbis. He was in dialogue with other religious thinkers, like Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a friend of his and was living in New York, and asking some of these questions in an era where existentialism is in vogue in philosophy, which he's a philosopher, Heschel, as well as a theologian. And I think he's trying to make an argument that God exists and that God is real. This was fundamental to him. It wasn't an abstract idea. It was real. And part of that is a dialogue with this world that he encountered in Berlin, and then a world that he was encountering in New York, of how you think of these questions. And I think the Holocaust was important. World War II, more broadly, with the atomic bomb, was important, but it was bigger than that. He was part of this rich conversation in the country in the 40s and 50s about these grand theological questions that I think we forget about. And today it's a little bit absent. He was a figure before civil rights. He was a public figure who people knew about. People read his ideas. He appeared in like Newsweek magazine. And it was articles not about activism. It was about these questions and what does Heschel have to say. Paul Tillich, who's another prominent figure in New York, he's on the cover of these magazines. It's this really amazing world where there was space for a dialogue and conversations about questions like what is God and what does it mean to live a pious life. And I think he very much wanted to be part of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting the picture you paint, because on the one hand, Heschel's public profile was on the rise. On the other hand, within the Jewish Theological Seminary, it seemed not quite as lonely as maybe at HUC, but a lonely existence, standing in contrast to the figure of Mordechai Kaplan at that time. And the irony, of course, is that when I went through the seminary, right, everyone claimed Heschel as, a great conservative. He was not a conservative rabbi, and nor did he seem terribly happy or well received within the Jewish Theological Seminary. So it's just this curiosity about these years at JTS.
There are certainly tensions. I mean, what I really learned about JTS is he wasn't an anomaly. It was just in this period, it was tied to conservative Judaism, but it was not wholly an institution of conservative Judaism. Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor, used to say it was a place to study traditional Judaism. It was more contrast to reform. But certainly, when he was recruited, that was part of the idea. He brought this Hasidic background and a kind of more formally ritualistic background for the students there, and that was attractive. There were tensions at JTS, and a lot of people who write about Heschel, especially rabbis, kind of talk about that. The personal tensions, that exists in every institution. What was interesting for me was what we just said in terms of different ideas about how do you revive, how do you strengthen, how do you make religious life, Jewish life, meaningful in this country and more broadly. And I think there was just, it was tension, but it was also part of what made JTS interesting. You had these giant figures having these debates. But certainly after his death, or really in the late 60s and onward, I think kind of his stature grew within the rabbinate, or certainly within JTS. And I spoke to many rabbis, kind of your generation and younger, who kind of really admire him very much and see him as a central figure.
It's a little gossipy, but did you come across anything that there was internal jealousy, that he sort of took on this national prominence as and certainly, well, I don't want to jump the gun, I want to ask you about his interfaith work, but when he becomes the guy to go to the Vatican, I have to imagine there were certain people saying, well, who appointed this guy to represent the Jewish people? Yeah,
no, there were tensions, and it's pre-Vatican because, again, his books are reaching they're not best-selling books, but they are part of the public discussion by the 50s when you have God in Search of Man. The Sabbath, which comes out in 1951, which many people have read, it's used as a Sabbath observance campaign by the United Synagogues, and it's being distributed all over the country. So I think there was some of that. There's also genuine tensions in terms of what he was arguing versus what some of the others were arguing. There was also just big egos at the institution. They were clashing. It's an era of really great rabbinic thought and debate. And so I think all of that was at play. But certainly jealousy is there, and it increases. I mean, by the late 60s, he must be one of the most prominent kind of rabbinic figures in the public sphere, especially when he's involved with Vietnam, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So I'm sure that was at play.
Right. No, it's very hard for me to relate to the idea of institutions with big egos. I'm in the university
world,
it must be
so.
a bygone era, a
Right.
timepiece sort of thing. So the thing is, his identification with human suffering, pathos and otherwise, at a certain point, or perhaps maybe it wasn't a certain point, perhaps it was a progression, there's an element of sort of exodus empathy, right? It's not just the condition of the Jewish people, but, well, I'm tempted to say a light bulb, but it doesn't sound like it was a light bulb. It sounds like it was over time that Heschel realized that his own experience wasn't just about the Jewish people, but it was rather looking around at the causes and those on the periphery of his moment. Can you talk about that transformation of being this Hasidic trained thinker to someone speaking to the issues of the day?
I think it happens pretty early on, frankly. I think even as early as his childhood in Warsaw, certainly in his own recollections, he remembers what it meant to him to see poverty, not just Jewish poverty, but poverty and suffering more broadly. Even in Warsaw, it was a very lively, robust world with all kinds of Jews, radical Jews, left-wing Jews, having these very vibrant debates. And he is in those circles by the time he's a teenager and he goes to college. I think the war for him, again, it wasn't simply about the Holocaust. It was about suffering more broadly. And when he starts to write about the war, he talks about it that way. He's not only talking about the affliction and brutality toward Jews, he's talking about how do we get this in the world of science and a world that is supposed to be so advanced. So I think by HUC, by the time he comes to America, this is someone who's very sensitive to the problems of social justice and suffering within the Jewish community, but beyond it. And I think it's an evolution. And he's a avid news follower. He watches the news at night. He reads the newspapers meticulously. And he does follow the news by the late 50s about what's happening in the South and some of the civil rights struggles that are brewing. So I don't think it's a eureka moment. I think this is someone who is deeply, had deep empathy for the human condition and saw the suffering of Jews in some ways as a way to understand more broadly the things we do wrong. If you look in the Sabbath, there's interesting parts. He's talking about the Sabbath as this moment, a period of time that becomes holy for Jews. And part of what, he has a couple lines where he says it's a way to get out of the commerce of this country and the material culture. He sounds like a non-religious critic. There were a lot of them at the time writing about it. So you can kind of see his own thinking is already extending beyond that. I think he had a line, I can't quote him perfectly, but that Auschwitz is a manifestation of a world without God, or what a world without God is capable of. And I think for him, that world wasn't simply the Jewish world. By the 60s, when he encounters the civil rights movement, he's prepared and already understanding and seeing more broadly the need to address injustice.
Thank you. So I want to explore his relationship with King. And full disclosure, my children go to a school, the Abraham Joshua Heschel School. And everywhere you go, there is noted with a photograph and otherwise of Heschel's relationship with King. So much so that a story that happened that my child said, do non-Jews observe Martin Luther King Day too when they were little? What's my question? Well, if I were to open up a biography of King, is his relationship with Heschel figured as prominently as Jews make it out to be? And so that's sort of where I want to lead to. But ultimately, or to begin with, the question is, how did the relationship begin? What was the substance of the relationship? How did these two people from such vastly different backgrounds generate the relationship that they had?
It is an important relationship, and I think for both men it was quite important. It starts in 1963, where Heschel's invited to speak through intermediaries who suggested him that he speak at the Interfaith Conference in Chicago on civil rights. And Heschel decides to do it. He goes and he gives it's a speech everyone should read. It's quite powerful and forceful. Remember, 1963, this is January, no civil rights bill has been proposed yet. President Kennedy is hesitant to move forward on this issue. And Heschel gives this speech where he uses the words that racism is Satanism. And he argues you can't actually be a religious person if you're racist. It's a contradiction. And the speech is dramatic. Everyone gives him a standing ovation when it's done. And King is quite impressed by the words that he uses, and they spend time together at this conference. And that's really where they get to know each other for the first time. They keep communicating. Heschel is still involved with different civil rights projects, primarily in the New York region. He's speaking at all these different interfaith conferences that form on a smaller level. And then they connect again, most dramatically, on March 21st, 1965, when King asks religious leaders to come to Selma and march this isn't the first march where John Lewis is beaten, but this is another march to keep putting pressure for voting rights, and they spend more time together then, and they'll continue to be in touch. I'm jumping ahead, but...
Which, by the way, I did receive a question from the audience saying how you felt that in the Selma movie they didn't highlight the picture or that relationship of King and Heschel.
I remember that. Well, I'll finish this one idea, and I can tell you about Selma. I remember that. But in April of 1967, for me, in some ways, this is the most important point of connection. Martin Luther King makes a speech at the Riverside Church where it's his first full-throated public statement of opposition to Vietnam. He had made some speeches, but he was very hesitant. He knew it would enrage Lyndon Johnson. Many civil rights leaders still supported Vietnam. In '67, it was still a popular war. And King makes this speech. He makes it at an event organized by Heschel and a small group of religious leaders against the war. And he trusted Heschel. That was the point of connection in that group. So I think it was important both ways. And it was important for Heschel because he did see in not just King, but many of the leaders he worked with and the actual activists, the people on the ground who he marched with, that kind of rage against injustice that's at the heart of his book, The Prophets. To say what people were accepting as normal, to yell and scream at what shouldn't be, that's what they were doing. So I think the relationship is not overstated. I think it was more than that march. That's the picture they see. It wasn't like that was it. It was a multi-year relationship, and Heschel's devastated, obviously, when King is assassinated. He partakes in some of the ceremony. Coretta King asks him to be part of this. So it's enduring. Selma, Selma got criticized at many levels. That was one small part. It was also how Lyndon Johnson was treated. I don't know. Hollywood can present a moment in different ways. It doesn't have to be totally accurate. And I don't know why he was not included. I think, and I don't remember, she said it was a different march she was captured, which is This is a later march. It wasn't the famous Bloody Sunday March. But I don't know, I focus on other debates. People making films about issues like civil rights and do it in a compelling way, God bless. We need more of that as opposed to many of the other movies we get.
We're going to come back to, actually, let's stay on it for a second. What was striking to me in reading your book was Heschel being able to pivot from the plight of Soviet Jewry to civil rights, to interfaith in Vietnam, which we'll get to. But it was also that King spoke out on issues of Jewish concern, which that seems like a timepiece, right? That you have, I think, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but I think it was King gave a speech on Soviet Jewry, which is, I just find to be extraordinary, that about the nature of this relationship, all the more so in our intersectional age, where the dividing lines are drawn in such different ways.
No, it's true. Heschel was involved very early in the Soviet Jewry issue. He was really one of the louder voices on this question before there's a full-blown movement. There's different ways in which this starts. There's a guy named, there's an article in Foreign Affairs by a prominent thinker who writes about this as a big question. There's a group in Cleveland of activists on this issue, and Heschel's in touch with a lot of them. He's speaking out about this. He speaks to the Rabbinical Assembly very forcefully about needing to see this as a bigger priority, always kind of referencing World War II when Jews stood by and didn't do anything. And this becomes a big issue for him, and other activists consider him one of the more vocal people in the early 60s. Elie Wiesel credits him with getting him interested in this issue before Wiesel writes a famous book about this. But King, because they are close, because they're working on some of these questions, there's several references where King talks about Soviet Jewry, 2 rabbis, 2 others. It's a point of connection. I'm sure part of it, as always, is strategic. It's a way to connect different parts of the community. But I think he genuinely saw, through Heschel and others, it's not only Heschel for sure, but he saw how these issues were not separate, how they were intertwined, and how these social justice concerns were global, they were interethnic, interreligious, and I think that was interesting to see the speeches where King was talking about this.
So, Vietnam, the turn, you mentioned this moment in '67, the first moment when King spoke out, but that was also a turning point for Heschel, I imagine, that he took a forceful stand. And this was in the later years of his life. Talk about that for a minute.
I mean, he does it even earlier. So each chapter of the book is organized around a city and a place. And the last one is Washington, because that's where a lot of the activism against Vietnam took place. Vietnam, we forget, until about 1968, much of the country supported the war. Civil rights leaders were divided over this, many of them either strategically not wanting to anger Lyndon Johnson, or genuinely, they were not against this war. And so to stand against the war was an act truly of bravery if you were a public figure. In '65, that's the first time Heschel gets involved in this. There's a group that meets at a church here in New York. It includes people like John Bennett, who's the head of the Union Theological Seminary. This group will involve William Coffin, who's from Yale, Richard Newhouse, a group of anti-war clergy. And they form in '65 this group of clergy against the Vietnam War. And by '66, they're starting to put together and create a network of activists and talk about why the war was misguided and talk about sympathy toward not simply U.S. soldiers, but they'll talk about the North Vietnamese, they'll talk about the Buddhists who the South Vietnamese are oppressing. and the clergy and laity against the Vietnam War, which is their group, CalCav. By 67, it's a presence in the anti-war movement, and it's unique because they bring a kind of moral clout that student activists in the minds of a lot of middle-class America didn't have. And they were always very careful to present themselves as a mainstream group that's not radical, but against the war. And so he did this early on. And he said, "Violence is obscene," is a quote that he has in The Prophets, which came out in 62. And I think it informed what he was watching with the war. So it's 2 years earlier. And so by the time King speaks, he's on board, he's promoting this position. A lot of the Rabbinical Assembly is not happy.
Right.
In 67, the Rabbinical Assembly puts out a statement supporting Vietnam and actually is condemning the people in this group, which is a way to talk about Heschel, because he's the Jewish figure in this group. And so he's taking a stand against many of his friends and colleagues at JTS and more broadly. So it's really interesting. This chapter for me was kind of a very eye-opening to see how deeply committed he was to this cause through the end of his life. By the end of his life, he was terribly frustrated and disheartened that with all the activism, with all the kind of movement building that had happened, the war was still raging under Nixon.
Heschel's work at the Vatican, what was the driver behind it? Was it just that he got the phone call and was invited, or was this sort of core to his vision of activism to build these relations?
Well, it was building relations, but it was about anti-Semitism. So when the Vatican has this moment where they're reconsidering doctrine, and in the post-World War II period, they're starting to think about what's the relationship between their doctrine and all sorts of issues, colonialism, anti-Semitism, and there's this opening. And Heschel is recruited by a guy named Mark Tannenbaum and some others from the American Jewish Committee to be a liaison with the Vatican. He takes it up. Even though there are many rabbis who don't think it's proper for a rabbi to have theological discussions, essentially, with the Vatican, because he's dealing with this problem of anti-Semitism that he has been living with and looking at and exploring and wrestling with his whole life. And here was a moment when it seemed that the Vatican had been a prime mover in the minds of many Jews in promoting doctrine that was used in anti-Semitic fashion to be involved with this. And he has ongoing negotiations for several years with the cardinal who's the voice of the Vatican on this. And I think that's what drove him. I don't think it was simply to be the Jewish figure who's dealing with this grand issue. I think it was an avenue to actually deal with anti-Semitism as an idea, not simply rescuing Jews, but getting to the heart of why so many people dislike Jews. And I think that drove him. And it was controversial. There were many who didn't understand why he was the one doing this when this becomes public. It was secret, many of the negotiations. There's many rabbis who thought it wasn't the right thing to do. But for him, I don't know. I think he saw very clearly the importance, and he believed in interfaith dialogue too. He didn't think it was improper. He thought it was important in many ways because ultimately all religions were dealing in his mind with this God of pathos that he believed in, and he didn't kind of restrict himself only to the Jewish community. This would be why in Vietnam he can be at the center of an interfaith movement as he was.
Right. So when we talk about these years, late 60s, early 70s, Heschel died in 72, we have to bring up Israel. The 67 war, a time of great triumph, but also great tension following. What was Heschel's relationship with Israel? How did he reconcile all of those tensions?
Yeah, he throughout the birth of Israel and the evolution of Israel, He considered himself a Zionist, not a political Zionist. He saw Israel as part, in some ways, of a global Jewish project. And he was more concerned about the state of Judaism than the state of Israel, meaning you couldn't have a vibrant state of Israel if Judaism was not what it should be, that we had to be able to have a country like Israel. That, for him, was the most important question. And are we worthy of Israel is really the issue that he talked about. He goes on his first trip in 1957 with his family. He's brought over as part of a conference. It was expensive to go there. He didn't make a lot of money. That was his kind of big initial trip. But then the war in 67 is incredibly disturbing to him. He's terrified that the state could be destroyed. He sees anti-Semitism as part of what is going on. He'll write about this in a book that comes out with his reflections on why Israel. Echo of Eternity. So he's very bothered, but this comes in 67, right when he's in the middle of the anti-war movement, and there are colleagues who don't understand, and they talk to him why he doesn't see what's going on in Israel as connected to what they're fighting against in other parts of the world, that it is an extension of imperialism. And it's hard for him because these are colleagues he's very close to, and he has a very different point of view. And he says, I'm not a pacifist. And he thinks in this case, Israel had a right to use force. But what was really interesting to me is that after this was over, he went right back to the anti-war movement, and he was comfortable with it. He was comfortable with those differences, and it was Vietnam that was really what he was most focused on. He was an era of American Jewish life where Israel was certainly important, but it wasn't the kind of overriding point of debate in politics or other kinds of questions. I think he was a product of that era. For him, what happens with race relations here in the country? What happens with this war where so many Americans are dying? What happens when we are spiritually kind of not what we need to be? Those were the questions that were very high. And they don't compete with Israel, but they're clearly just as important for him. That's why he can kind of go right back to the anti-war group, even with these tensions. So, moving forward beyond the span of Heschel's lifetime, and I had someone shared with me the piece you have in today's Washington Post about what the transformation that's happened from the moral voice of the progressive left to the rise of evangelicism and the Christian right. It seems that we've come a long way from sort of Koff and Niebuhr, Heschel being the dominant theological voices on the scene to a very different moment. It's probably a whole evening unto itself, but it just seems like we're in a different moment now. No, it's very, his world in some ways was not lost, but it was eclipsed. Part of the story is the rise of the religious right and the moral majority in this country, which just dominated the political stage since the 1970s and became a really powerful force in American politics. So they captured the spotlight. I think there were many liberals and progressives who shied away from religion because of that. They connected religion to conservatism, and it was seen as a force that would always lead you to the world of the evangelical right, to the world of restricting reproductive freedom and those kinds of questions. And so I think within liberal communities there is often a shying away from religious leaders being at the forefront. Heschel, I digress, but what's interesting is he wasn't just a Jew involved in politics. His Judaism informed his politics. There was a direct connection between his writing in the 50s and where he ended up on the streets, and there just wasn't a lot of room for many liberals for that. And I think within the Jewish community, the debates over Israel became all-consuming, and some of the figures who wanted to talk about these other questions fade a bit. And so I think for a long time, his world wasn't forgotten, but it was a relic. It was that picture you saw when you were at camp of Heschel marching and what used to be. I think there's some voices now who are emerging, and that was part of the article, who are trying to bring that back, from Rabbi Jill Jacobs of a group called Trua, that's a human rights group, to Reverend William Barber, who's one of the most, I think, influential figures right now on questions like poverty and voting rights and racial justice. But that's why I didn't write the book for that reason, but I think it's a really important world where religion is not separate from these social justice questions, but has a way to inform how we think about them, how to kind of mobilize action on problems we allow to just continue all the time. And Heschel's a great voice to think about that and to remember what it can offer.
Right. I have to say, I received the most number of questions submitted were some version of what would Abraham Joshua Heschel say today? Right? Obviously, you know, a question we can't answer, but specifically within the Jewish fold, where he would situate himself on the issues of the day, given the transformation in identity politics. I'm not talking about the broader scene, I'm talking about within the Jewish community, where the movement's gone, where the Israel conversation has gone, where Jewish literacy and intermarriage and, you know, all the questions that are on my docket as a contemporary Jew and a rabbi, you know, where he would fit today.
I think he'd be very frustrated, and I think you can read some of his work in the 50s was about the synagogue and it was about the rabbinate. This was another reason there were tensions in JTS. He was very critical of what he saw conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism doing, and Orthodox Judaism, to be honest. And I think the Pew studies that come out in the last few years, not simply about intermarriage, but leaving the synagogue and not having an attachment to Jewish institutions, that's what he was trying to warn against all the time. This was his tension with Kaplan. Don't make beautiful synagogues that don't have people in the pews. Don't tell people to pray. Explain how you pray and why you pray. And I think his writing was a quest to convey this meaning of spirituality. Why kind of do the mitzvahs in the modern world? That my guess is, and I can't speak for someone who's not with us anymore, that he would read all these studies and he would see some of the struggles American Judaism has and says, this is what I was saying. Not that he was right, he would lament it, but that we need to kind of inject spiritual life into our communities. He'd be very disheartened with the politics of the country. I think you can say that pretty affirmatively. A lot of the issues he cared about, they've moved the wrong way. You know, he would be shedding tears if he watched the video of George Floyd. There's no way to imagine he wouldn't. And it wasn't a surprise when the Rabbinical Assembly released a statement when that happened, quoting Heschel, and the need to see that as not tolerable. And I think he'd also be frustrated with the hardened divisions in Judaism. He's from this period when they were forming and there were divisions, but there was more fluidity. There was room for a Hasidic guy with a more orthodox outlook on Judaism to be at JTS and to interact with rabbis. And even at the community level, I don't think he'd like the divided lines that Samuel Friedman, the journalist, wrote about that exist in the community. That wasn't his Judaism that he aspired to. So I think on many levels, he'd be very kind of disheartened with where we are today.
So with the writing of every book, there's has to be countless stories. You shared one story of coming across a program with your father's name in it, I think it was. So what was one of the, what did you stumble across? What did you see? Was there like a Geniza aha moment, like I can't believe I'm holding this in my hand, a piece of correspondence, just a moment in putting this book together that was a eureka moment?
Not a eureka moment, but that kind of excitement. So his papers, his archives are at Duke University, where they have a very kind of fine Jewish history collection. And so one document, which a historian's always looking for, was this, I can't remember, it was 6 pages or something, but basically his notes, his thoughts as he was marching in Selma. He literally kind of gave different impressions from being in the church where they all met, waiting for King to come, and just feeling the silence and the fear of about to leave and go into what was terrifying. They had been informed ahead of time that gun sales were up. They were informed to look straight ahead because there'd be white mobs yelling the worst things at them. And he writes about kind of what it felt like to be there, and then he writes about the magnificent feeling of marching on the street and feeling like he was back in Poland marching with Hasidic rabbis, that euphoria, and he felt the spirituality in many ways that was missing. And so to find a document where he's talking about all this, right down to an encounter in the airport when he was leaving with a waitress who's being kind of hostile to him, and he's asking for a kosher food, basically, no meat, nothing, and she doesn't understand what this guy's doing. And she says he looks like Santa Claus, and then he makes a joke at the end, at least I made you believe that Santa Claus exists. And to find that written by the person was great. The other thing in the Heschel archives, which I loved, it's not eureka, but he wrote notes on index cards, like just random thoughts. And to go through that, you're going through the mind of this person you're writing about, was just unbelievably amazing. I think that Auschwitz line, for example, is just jotted down in some notes. And then at JTS, they have papers from other biographers of him with interviews that were conducted. And those were really great. I looked at those. I didn't even know they were there because they just had received them. And I saw them right before COVID. It was like my last archive chance. And I heard through the interviews with people who knew him very intimately, really about who he was as a person and both the difficult parts of the relationship, but also why he could be just so inspiring at a personal level. Those are the kind of documents that really fueled this book for me.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Zelizer, the scholarship, the archival work is extraordinary, and you have retrieved a figure for a new generation to appreciate, bringing light not just to his story, but the importance of his story to our present circumstance. It is a fabulous book. It's an important book. It's a book you can purchase if you have a credit card immediately following the program, or go online, as Mara said. And I just want to congratulate you, my friend, on this incredible contribution. Mazel tov, mazel tov.
Thank you very much.